Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today for our forum on access to opportunity, creating a level playing field for entrepreneurship. I'm Jessica Looze, the Director of Knowledge Creation and Research here at the Kauffman Foundation, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's event along with my colleague, Jason Wiens, the Director of Policy at the Kauffman Foundation. Today, we'll be diving into several policies that shape access to entrepreneurial opportunities that were recently highlighted in the Kauffman Foundation's America's New Business Plan, a policy roadmap focused on creating new jobs and rebuilding an equitable economy that works for everyone. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, I would encourage you to do so following today's forum. We'll share the link in the chat. America's New Business Plan consists of 4 pillars: access to opportunity, access to funding, access to knowledge, and access to support. Today, we're going to dig into the first of these, access to opportunity, a level playing field without red tape. We have 2 great panels lined up for today. The first panel will focus on the research landscape surrounding access to entrepreneurial opportunities, including barriers related to debt, non-compete agreements, and occupational licensing. Our panelists will discuss a variety of issues surrounding the difficulties individuals encounter when thinking about starting businesses, challenges stemming from historic and structural barriers, such as the racial wealth gap, as well as legal and regulatory barriers that can make moving in and out of jobs and starting a business difficult. Our second panel will include a conversation among individuals working in the policy space, applying research findings to inform policymaker action. These individuals come from organizations advocating for expanded access to economic opportunities, and each have a particular experience working on the topics our first panel will highlight. Following the presentations from our panelists, there will be a moderated Q&A. Please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box throughout the presentations. We will select from audience questions and facilitate a discussion among the panelists. The Entrepreneurship Issue Forums are a series that we host in order to bring research, practice, and policy together and to focus on a specific topic around entrepreneurship. As a reminder, as with every forum, the Kauffman Foundation takes no legislative or political position on the discussions. And with that, let's turn to our first panel, whom I will be introducing and serving as moderator for this morning. Joining us for our first panel today is Mr. Stephen Brown, a Senior Research Associate at the Center for Labor, Human Services, and Population, and the Associate Director of the Racial Equity Analytics Lab at the Urban Institute. We also have with us today Dr. Morris Kleiner, a professor at the University of Minnesota, and Dr. Evan Starr, an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, Robert H. Smith School of Business. I'll invite each of our panelists to share remarks before beginning a discussion. So with that, I'll invite Mr. Stephen Brown to begin.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm here to talk to you today about personal debt and entrepreneurship. I think one of my top line takeaways is not going to be especially a surprise-stating one at all, that more personal debt makes it harder to be an entrepreneur. Of course, there's some nuance around that statement, depending on the kind of debt a person has, how current or delinquent they are with that debt, and their debt to income ratios. But in general, more debt is going to make it harder to start a business, which should be no surprise. I entered this space with a focus on racial equity, particularly as it relates to individual and family economic mobility and wealth building. And as you heard from the introduction, I also come at this more from a researcher perspective than that of a practitioner. And so wealth is, of course, understood most simply as what you own minus what you owe. And a key area of interest to me is bringing more attention to the debt side of this wealth equation. Unfortunately, the distribution of United States is incredibly uneven across race and ethnicity. Our most recent representative national data we have from 2019, which of course before the pandemic hit, shows that white families held 8 times the wealth of Black families and 5 times the wealth of Latino families. In dollar terms, white families held a little over $189,000 in wealth at the median, compared to $36,000 for Latino families and just over $24,000 for Black families at the median. And so looking at the debt side of this, we have credit bureau data that shows that 24% of households in predominantly white communities have some form of debt and collections, which is a way a focus on debt and collection is a way we kind of separate out good debt like mortgages from the bad personal debt. And so 24% of households in predominantly white communities have some form of debt and collection, compared to 39% of white households in communities of color. Households of community of color also have higher amounts of past due debt, so it's not just that they're more likely to have it, but the amounts that they have in debt or past due debt are also higher, and hold more debt across different kinds of debt. So they have more medical debt, more car loan debt, and student loan debt. Student loan debt is particularly an issue here, which I'll talk a little bit more about, because people of color, in particular Black people, have higher student loan debt to income ratios, and are much more likely to default on that debt as well. And so that debt becomes, the process of getting an education for many folks of color becomes potentially more of a burden on the back end when it comes to entrepreneurship, because they're carrying this relatively higher debt load, which, of course, student loan can be considered a good or neutral debt, but it is still a debt that restricts income flow and your ability to raise funds or allocate funds to investments or the opportunities to start a business. And so what does this mean for entrepreneurship? We know, of course, that people of color have lower rates of business ownership, that we've seen faster growth among people of color starting businesses in the past several years. But often when we think about the challenges facing entrepreneurs, particularly entrepreneurs of color, the issue that's raised most often is challenges in access to sufficient and patient capital, which of course I'm sure everyone here is familiar with that refrain. And of course, part of the issue with that access to capital lies in these disproportionate amounts of debt, which will make it harder to apply for student loans, especially if you're using your personal credit information. And again, student loan debt makes this a particularly thorny issue. While the inability to access capital at rates and amounts equal to those of white entrepreneurs has create challenges for many entrepreneurs of color and potential entrepreneurs of color. Recent studies have also found that the higher amounts of student loan debt have a negative effect on entrepreneurship, which can be really limiting, of course, to people who may otherwise have the skill sets or the connections necessary to start and run a successful business. And so at Urban, we've thought a little bit more about really trying to highlight and understand the debt side of this equation, and also to try to make recommendations to address debt. And so in one study that we've done in Chicago, we looked explicitly at how we could raise and increase wealth at the local level, particularly for people of color. And we really tried to look at both the asset side of the equation and the debt side of the equation. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the debt side of this here. And so I think there are so ultimately, I think one of the thinking about this as a barrier, right? There's a couple of different ways to address this. One way is to try to develop and support programs that help people of color reduce their debt load and therefore increase their credit eligibility to apply for credit. And so in terms of programs that can help either manage or reduce debt, we've looked at local interventions for financial empowerment through utility payments, a program called Lift Up. It was implemented in 5 cities and offered debt reduction and debt restructuring to give participants longer terms and more lenient repayment arrangements, individualized financial counseling, financial incentives, and ongoing support. And increasingly, employers are actually also supporting these kinds of debt reduction programs, which are going to help prioritize financial security and access to affordable credit for folks who then might be able to take that improved financial standing and relay it to the opportunity to build a business. Some banks are also experimenting with credit products with more affordable terms. and limiting application fees and requirements that the consumers build savings to cover future expenses. The National Credit Union Administration created a federal payday alternative loan program for credit union members so that they wouldn't have to rely as much on those kinds of alternative lending products. And of course, we know that people of color have less access to traditional banks and banking products. And so people who do not have access to those traditional banking products often have to turn to those high risk short-term loans and alternative financial institutions when they face a financially disruptive event, which of course can happen more frequently when families have less access to wealth and lower income. And so when they turn to these products, it can also have in turn affect their future earnings because they're paying back this interest and they can't get quite caught up when they're using payday loans. And so, payday lenders make these small loans that make it really hard to pay back. And these loans are accompanied by exorbitant interest fees. And so some states are to work to address those fees and to reduce usury rates. Which is one way to kind of help curb the need for those kind of products, but there's still a need to kind of stand up alternative lending products instead of those kind of products that help folks be able to access capital that is a bit more patient, that is doesn't have quite the same high level of requirements. A lot of CDFIs have experimented with these kind of products, credit unions are experimenting with these kind of products. And we're finding increasing success in being able to lend to folks successfully, even if they have less than perfect credit scores. And so, again, one option is to find ways to kind of reduce that debt. And of course, the other way is to try to increase opportunities for lending, which I just spoke about. But I think ultimately, it's not a big surprise that debt is such a big issue in terms of being able to start a business. And so I think, as I think about in terms of what this means for increasing entrepreneurship for people of color, I think we really have to consider more like both the debt side, the kinds of debt that people hold, whether it's student loan debt or other kinds of debt, and what programs can help support people to either reduce that debt or to work to pay it off. I think, of course, it's going to be a challenge to start a new business if you have a large debt load on your personal books. So I think thinking about solutions to help entrepreneurs as they're going through training programs to become small business owners, to help figure out that debt side of the equation would be a really helpful and useful piece, as well as, of course, lending products that help kind of take that into account and provide more patient and reasonable terms for folks to be able to pay back that debt while they're also starting their own business. So I thank you for the opportunity to talk today. I'm happy to answer any additional questions around race and wealth and debt and entrepreneurship. And so with that, I feed it back to Jessica.
Thank you, Stephen. That was great. And you raise a lot of really important things that I want to dig into a little bit later in our discussion. But first, I'd like to open up to Dr. Morris Kleiner to talk with us a little bit about occupational licensing and its relationship to entrepreneurship.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to present today. And also at the Kauffman Foundation, I spent about 13 years down the road from the Kauffman Foundation in Lawrence, Kansas. So glad to reacquaint myself with the Kauffman Foundation. So thank you. I wanted to first of all define occupational licensing, which is a government mandate which deals with the ability of individuals' right to practice an occupation. And that distinguishes itself from what's called certification, which is a right to title. And I'm just sort of giving you occupational licensing 101 because these are some important definitions. So in terms of occupational licensing, it is a government requirement that if you don't meet certain requirements, you cannot practice in an occupation. And that differs from certification, which is a right to title. So you can only practice that occupation. You can only say that you are qualified to practice an occupation if you've met certain requirements. Now, occupational licensing has grown dramatically from around 5% of the workforce in the 1950s to between 20 and 25% of the workforce now. And that's twice as many individuals are covered by government occupational licensing requirements than are in unions or are covered by the federal minimum wage. So unions are around 10, 12%. Federal minimum wage is a couple of percent more. Occupational licensing is twice what people think of as more important labor market institutions. So I'd like to give you what some of the impacts might be, and glad to share my screen with you. Again, thank you for the opportunity to present at the Kauffman Foundation. And wanted to start out with a quote by Alexis de Tocqueville, who started out wandering through America and wanted to tell Europeans what the new Americans were like, and noted about issues of mobility and entrepreneurship that Americans find it easy to change professions and make the most of it, depending on the needs of the moment. So you'll find some who have been successively lawyers, farmers, merchants, evangelical ministers, and doctors. So at least at the beginning of the Republic, people were able to change from one occupation to another, and to some extent advance their ability to be entrepreneurs across a wide variety of different occupations and professions. More recently, that has changed, certainly as the economy and the way of doing business has changed. Entrepreneurship and the ability to move across occupations has changed. So licensing and what I call labor market dynamics, occupational licensing is the dotted red line, and you can see it's grown from about 5% of the workforce to now between 20 to 25%. More recently, there's been a very significant decline in occupational switching rates. That is the change from one occupation to another. I assume you can see them now. The growth of occupational licensing, and there's been a decline in switching. The ability of individuals to go from one occupation to another has declined fairly dramatically over time. Also, this manifests itself in switching rates, the ability to change from one occupation. So this is information on people who go from one job to another. So the people who are not licensed, that's the vast majority of occupations, about 75% of workers in the US are not licensed, but they enjoy a much higher ability to go from being a computer programmer, coder, to move to a wide variety of occupations, where individuals who are in licensed occupations find it more difficult to switch occupations. The same thing is true with respect to switching out of occupations. So people are not licensed are able to go out of occupations, move from one occupation to another. But people who are licensed tend to be much less likely to leave those occupations. So using the analogy to one of my favorite rock groups, the Eagles, people who are occupationally licensed are much like Hotel California. They come, but they hardly ever leave, relative to individuals who are not in licensed occupations. Similarly, people who are in licensed occupations also tend to move across state lines. And this is sort of an overall trend in the US economy, is that there's been a decline in interstate migration. This may have been changed somewhat with the recent pandemic, but as occupational licensing has grown, interstate migration, that is the mobility across states, has declined, in part due to licensing. So if you're moving across state lines, if you're moving from Missouri to Minnesota, for example, you must meet a wide variety of additional requirements. So Yesterday, when I went to my dental hygienist, she said she moved from Wisconsin to Minnesota and she had to take a wide variety of tests. A number of the people she talked to failed those tests, and that meant that they couldn't practice couldn't practice being a dental hygienist for a period up to 2 years if they failed any part of the test. So this reduces the ability of people to move across state lines. So this has been a real impediment for individuals to take advantage of their abilities, move to where the job opportunities are, in large part because of occupational licensing. Now, in terms of policy, there have been a number of changes. Arizona led the charge, and now if you move to the state of Arizona, you're licensed in another state, you can automatically become licensed if you're a resident and have a license in another state. 7 other states have now taken up the call and have allowed individuals who are licensed in one state to move to those states. So some of this decline may be changed as a result of the changes in state policies. But overall, occupational licensing has resulted in a decline in cross-occupation mobility of the kind that de Tocqueville talked about, and also has resulted in a decline in the ability to move to where the jobs are and take advantage of opportunity. So overall, licensing has tended to be sand rather than grease in the mechanism of the labor market and the ability of individuals to become entrepreneurs. So wanted to thank you again for the opportunity to discuss the implications of occupational regulation, and look forward to answering some of your questions in terms of the implications and effects of occupational licensing for individuals, entrepreneurship, and the ability to take advantage of economic opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you, Morris. We look forward to discussion shortly. I'd like to invite our third and final speaker in this first panel, Dr. Evan Starr, to share a bit about non-compete agreements.
Welcome, my name is Evan Starr from the University of Maryland, and they asked me to talk about non-competes and entrepreneurship. I'm going to broaden it a little bit and talk about restrictive covenants generally. And so let me just begin with what are restrictive covenants. And usually these are post-employment restrictive covenants. And these are parts of your employment contract that dictate what you can do following the end of an employment relationship. And so some common restrictions are a non-disclosure agreement where you can't disclose information that you learned on your job. There's a non-solicitation agreement, which says that you can't solicit coworkers or clients if you were to take up another opportunity. And then there's a non-compete agreement, which is that you can't join or start a competitor, typically for a few years or in a geographic area after you leave. And so just to give you an example of a non-compete agreement, this is a contract that you would sign if you were going to be a volunteer coach of a company called Girls on the Run. In this case, they're based in Silicon Valley. And you would have to agree to this provision in your employment clause. In this case, you are a volunteer coach to help middle school girls go on runs after school. And if you just go straight to the second bullet point, it says, as a coach and volunteer, I agree that I may not create or help develop a program that has similar goals and structure to that of Girls on the Run International within a 2-year period of my involvement with Girls on the Run. And so the kind of key takeaway here is that a non-compete is going to prohibit you from not only joining a competitor, but also starting a competitor. So one natural question is, well, how common are all these employment terms? So I want to show you some recent data that I have coming from this recent working paper. And we've surveyed about 35,000 individuals. And we've asked them whether they've agreed to an NDA, non-solicitation of clients agreements, whether they've agreed not to recruit their coworkers, or whether they've signed a non-compete. And you can see here in the graph, I won't go through all the numbers, but non-disclosure agreements are the most common. About 57% of workers in the United States in 2017 had agreed to one. Non-solicitation agreements are less common, about 28% of workers, and non-competes are the least common, about 22% of workers, according to this data. We've also asked firms how frequently they deploy these provisions. And so we have survey data from about 1,500 firms. Again, non-disclosure agreements are being used across the board. 71% of firms in our sample say they're using non-disclosure agreements with all of their workers. If you just fast forward over to non-competes, you can see that 29.5% of firms in our data say they're using non-competes with every worker in their firm. That would include, of course, all the low-wage workers as well as the high-wage workers. And a further 37% say they use non-competes only for some workers in their firm. And so, broadly, we're talking about, these contracts affecting, broadly speaking, more than half of workers, but getting to non-competes, roughly one in 5 workers. When it comes to non-compete agreements specifically, this is where most of the empirical work and evidence has come from. And so I'm going to focus mostly on non-competes. And one of the key features of non-compete agreements is that states have very different policies. And so here's a map that's dated now, but this is the map of basically what it looked like in 2019, where you have 3 states that do not enforce non-competes. Those are California, North Dakota, Oklahoma. This has changed recently, as I said. And then you have states that would enforce non-competes under some circumstances. And then you have states that would enforce them under a wide variety of circumstances. And so the point to highlight here that's going to come up a lot is that, California was one of the first states to ban non-competes. And of course, this is one of the hotbeds of entrepreneurship and innovation. I'll touch more on that later. As I said, these policies are changing quite a bit. Here's just one snippet from a month ago. That right now there are 21 states with 45 pending non-compete bills. That's not counting federal non-compete bills that are also being issued. So this is a really dynamic policy space that's being discussed quite a bit. So the question is how do all of these post-employment restrictions, or how does the laws that enforce them or don't enforce them, how do they affect entrepreneurship and innovation? And so that's what I want to try to touch on with some of this research here. And I won't go into all the detail, but I'll give you kind of the main highlights. Before I do that, though, I just want to talk about some theory, because there's some interesting tensions here on how these covenants might relate to entrepreneurship and innovation. And so there's first the argument that non-competes are good for innovation and entrepreneurship. And the whole idea here is that a non-compete allows you to protect an investment, right? Because if I'm a new firm and I have some new technology, now the coworkers that I have that I've hired can't go and take that and start a competitor to compete with me. And so in this sense, non-competes are kind of like a form of intellectual property protection, like patents. And we might think that people might want to start a new firm because they can protect their investments. Of course, there's a counter argument to that, which is that where we see Silicon Valley growing up in California, a non-compete is a barrier to you starting a company. And so it could be that a non-compete would preclude you from starting your own company in the first place. It may also preclude you from hiring workers in the first place, because non-competes would make that more difficult as well. And of course, when workers are more mobile, when workers are able to cross firm boundaries and share ideas, that could also spur innovation more than the incentives that non-competes might give to invest. Okay, and so there's a counter argument there. There's another story that the non-competes can only be good because workers voluntarily agree to them. And so the idea here is if you wanted to become an entrepreneur and to start a competing company, then you wouldn't agree to a non-compete in the first place unless it was in your best interest. Maybe you're going to learn some trade secret. Maybe you are going to really understand some nuances of the business that would help you start your company in the future. Maybe it's a good trade for you. But of course, that's not always the reality. And in many cases, what we have are non-competes that are thrust upon workers on the first day of the job. They didn't know they were going to get into it. Maybe workers don't even negotiate or even see these terms until they're trying to leave. Okay, and so there's some counter arguments here. So when you look at the theory, there's been debates about whether non-competes are going to be good for entrepreneurship innovation, whether they're going to be bad. So what does the evidence show? Well, so the first point of evidence is that banning non-competes raises new firm entry. And so this is coming from one of my papers, where what we leverage is several states that banned physician non-competes in the 70s and 80s. And we look at what happens to the number of medical practices before and after these bans take place relative to a bunch of control states. And we find that new firm entry rises by about 4%. Hyo Kang and Lee Fleming have another recent paper that looks at what happened when Florida dramatically increased its policy and was much more likely to enforce non-competes. And they find that there are relatively fewer small new establishments that come about 4%. So it looks like if you enforce non-competes, it's bad for entrepreneurship. Or conversely, if you were to relax enforcement, new firms would be more likely to arise. The second point that's important, though, is that non-competes are also hiring barriers. So even if you can successfully start a new firm, if everyone in the market is bound by non-competes, it may be hard for you to hire new workers, right, to grow your business. And so I'm not going to go through the numbers here, but in this paper I have with Natarajan Balasubramanian and Mariko Sakakibara, we find that when states more vigorously enforce non-compete agreements, there are the new firms that are started are smaller on average, and they're more likely to die in their first few years. Okay, and so it's not just about the reduced entry, it's also what happens conditional on being able to enter. Okay, on the investment front, we do have some mixed evidence here on whether non-competes can actually spur investment and innovation. Of course, there's a Silicon Valley argument I've already covered. There's some evidence from Samila and Sorensen that venture capital doesn't go as far in states that enforce non-competes, and Mark Garmay has evidence that that if you enforce non-competes, the firms invest less. There's countervailing evidence on that point. I just want to highlight one piece of interesting work here, which is by Jessica Jeffers, where she says, look, we only see positive investment effects in markets that were already really highly competitive, right? And in a market that's not competitive, firms are probably making all the investments that they need to already. And so it's only in these really highly competitive labor markets that we're finding positive investment effects. Okay, so with this in mind, I want to highlight one really important caveat. All of these studies I've talked about so far are studies of state policy, right? What happens when a state bans non-competes or enforces them more vigorously? And those sorts of studies do not pick up the use and effects of non-competes themselves, because there's no data in those of whether the firm uses non-competes or whether a worker is bound by them. And that would include whether non-competes are entirely unenforceable. And so I just want to highlight at the end here one really important avenue, which is that unenforceable non-competes are totally common, right? At the outset, I read you a non-compete in California for a for-profit worker. That non-compete would never be sanctioned by any court. And what we have here is that in California, if you look at this recent study by Kauffman and Shearholz, that in California, 28.6% of employers use non-competes with all of their workers, right? And that's just marginally lower than the national average of 31.8%. Okay, so a natural question is like, well, maybe workers know the law, maybe they realize it's unenforceable. And so I have some evidence on that from a very recent working paper where we ask workers, what do you know about the law? Are non-competes enforceable in your state or are they not? And when you ask workers if they know the law, it turns out that they tend to believe that non-competes are enforceable. And they are in most places. And so in this graph, I'm showing you that where non-competes are actually enforceable, 74% of workers get it right. They think they're enforceable. But if you look at the states where they're not enforceable, the California, the North Dakota, the Oklahoma, what we find is that 70% of workers here are actually misinformed about the law. They think their non-compete is enforceable when in fact no court would sanction it. Okay, and so this is important because what people believe would happen is what actually drives their actions. And so in the rest of this paper, what we do is we inform workers about the law. We tell them, hey, in California, no court would sanction this, and then we ask them what if this would be if they would be more likely to start a business. And that's exactly what we find. That if you inform workers about these unenforceable non-competes, that workers in California say, oh wow, I'd be much more likely to start a business now. Okay, and just put some numbers on that. Non-compete signers who believe their non-competes are enforceable are 57 percentage points less willing to start a competitor. And finally, one important point to mention though is that even among workers who know that their non-compete is not enforceable, even if they do not think they're going to get sued, 12 to 25% of them still see their non-compete as a barrier. Okay, and this is my last slide here. So let me wrap up. To summarize, I think at this point, there's growing evidence that non-competes limit entrepreneurship and growth for new firms. Most states still enforce non-compete agreements to a wide degree, although the tide is shifting. And we know that some policies here are effective, like banning non-compete agreements, but it's really not clear what we should be doing with unenforceable non-competes that are still being used despite these state policies and the chilling effects that they could have on workers. So the opportunities I see for future work, non-competes are just one, as I let off with this myriad of contracts. There are other ones that could similarly deter entrepreneurship that we really haven't studied. And then, of course, there's this historical data that Morris has on what's happening in entrepreneurship over time and the rise in occupational licensing. We have nothing like that on non-competes and these other provisions. And so there's a great opportunity to do historical work to see if these have been rising over time and to establish how they're related to the broader trends we've been seeing in the startup rates. So that's it.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you all. And now I'll invite all of our panelists from panel 1 to turn your videos on and we'll begin a discussion. I would invite all of our audience members, if you have questions that you'd like to put into the Q&A, I'll be fielding those as part of the discussion here with our panelists. I want to open it up by talking a little bit about this intersection of research and policy. So, at the Kauffman Foundation, we're interested in this connection between research and practice and policy, and that's one of the reasons that we host these forums, is to bring together these conversations. So you've each talked quite a bit about the research findings that are really relevant to policy. And I'm wondering if you can share from your own experience working with those in policy spaces to make your research visible and to help inform decision making. What have you found that works well in those experiences, and what have been some of the biggest challenges in connecting research and policy through your work? And I'll just open that up to anyone who might want to respond.
Well, I'm glad to at least talk about occupational licensing, because there's been some real important shifts over time. In the 1990s through the early 2000s, there was very little interest in occupational licensing, and as a result of a number of policy makers, people in the Obama administration especially became very interested in this, and a lot of times narratives will really matter. So Michelle Obama ran into someone who was at a military base, and they were moving from North Carolina to California, and the trailing spouse was a teacher, and they were going to have to go on food stamps because the military didn't pay enough, and the teacher, the trailing spouse, couldn't become a teacher until they went back to school for a few years. So this spearheaded a great deal of work in occupational licensing. I had been working on this and became very much involved with this, both at the national level, and had some opportunities to testify in both houses of Congress and be involved with the administration. And also, it was just sort of lucky. Alan Kruger, who was a co-author of mine, also became head of the Council of Economic Advisors, and we spearheaded a lot of work that has been done. And that has led to relaxing occupational licensing requirements in terms of what I mentioned, the ability to move across state lines. 8 states within the last 2 years have allowed individuals from other states to move if they're licensed, and immediately become licensed in the state they've moved to. In addition, in the pandemic, a number of occupations relaxed their occupational licensing requirements. So individuals who are respiratory therapists, who are nurses, who are dealing with individuals with COVID, were allowed to immediately practice once they graduated from respiratory therapy school or nursing school, and obtain provisional licenses to allow them to fill these very dramatic needs of individuals who became ill. So, and that was largely spearheaded by the work that has been done that I've been involved with, a number of others. Alan Kruger became involved in, and a number of others who have provided the intellectual background to allow a lot of these policy changes to occur. So I think that at least that may be a case study, but certainly in terms of occupational licensing, the research that's been built up, some of which was funded by the Kauffman Foundation in terms of putting together provisions, allowing us to develop, as Evan said, we have a very nice long historical database, both on people who are licensed as well as the statutes, the origins and evolution of the statutes dealing with occupational licensing, and having that intellectual background allowed policymakers to make these changes to relax occupational licensing, both at the federal level, but mainly at the state level.
Yeah, I'll also add that it took me a second to think about this because since I sit at a policy research organization, it's kind of hard for me to disentangle where the research ends and the policy begins. But I think for where I sit, I think what we do is we try to ensure that we have really close connections with whatever change makers are in the space where we're working. So I think in this case, it's CDFIs, federal agencies that have connections and relations to entrepreneurship, so SBA, for instance, Department of Treasury, and others, EDA. So trying to make sure that we're establishing connections, that we're doing research that support pursuing research that comes out of whatever RFPs that they or CFIs that they may release, working with fintech organizations to better understand how they're seeing the field and what kind of tools that they're developing, especially along the lines of helping to either research or evaluate efforts or initiatives, or even making recommendations to some of their updates that might allow for a broader or more equitable use of their tools, working with employers to understand how they might be involved in helping to support lending to employees. So this is an area of growth for us, and I think also for employers to think about lending to employees and small dollar loans. So I think it's just really trying to be, at least for us, invested with the folks who are the implementers and change makers to work with them to figure out what are the research gaps that they need addressed, and to begin to try to do that research to make recommendations from what we found in the research for improvements to their programs, but also, of course, do general research that might help understand and advance the field. And again, making those connections with the relevant players in the space. But yeah, so it's kind of hard to think about, okay, how do we do our work? But yeah, that's the kind of things that the way we try to approach connecting the research and the policy pieces.
I'll just add briefly that I think anecdotes, the combination of anecdotes that really grab people's attention, plus research that people can learn more about if they want to know more. And in my case, Jimmy John's was found to be using these really onerous non-competes with their minimum wage sandwich makers, and that got a lot of media attention. And policymakers jumped into action, and they wanted to know, how common are these? How are they affecting workers and firms? What are the policy options? Even though non-competes have been around since the 1400s, they hadn't really got that much attention. Every now and a while, every here and there, some states would pick up on them, but never really any broad attention until that case. And then I just happened to have numbers on how common they were, and paired with some other research that I was doing, some funded by the Kauffman Foundation, we were able to provide that information to policymakers, and then it kind of took off from there.
Great, thank you all. We had a question come in through the chat asking specifically about barriers to entrepreneurship faced by Indigenous people, particularly those who are living on reservations. And I'm curious, in terms of sort of the body of your work and the challenges that you have studied related to entering entrepreneurship, specifically around Indigenous people, or around various demographic groups. I know, Stephen, you touched a little bit upon communities of color and the particular debt burdens. So curious about what you have studied in terms of how these policies and practices are affecting various groups differently, and related to that, what data is needed to better and more fully understand the experiences of various individuals who are thinking about entrepreneurship.
That's a fantastic question, and a question that's been probably related set of questions, how I spend the bulk of my time at the moment. So the short answer that I didn't talk about Indigenous people in my presentation because up until recently and even now, there's very limited data on small business ownership and entrepreneurship among Indigenous populations, and so of course, this is related to the smaller population numbers, but I think that increasingly is like, while an important factor, is not an excuse for understanding and better understanding the needs of that particular community and other communities of color. And so I think the challenge is that we have less data at the moment, so it does make it harder to report, especially on trends, especially at the national level. But one of the things that we're working on, spending a lot of time working on at the moment, is trying to work with the federal government, particularly statistical agencies of the federal government, to figure out ways to improve data collection on communities of color. And so this ranges from like creating synthetic data sets that allow for more precise understandings of certain populations, using imputation methods where we would actually develop a new variable that can essentially replicate the racial distribution onto data sets that do not have racial information. And so we're experimenting with some techniques to roll that out more broadly, to use that imputation to kind of bring that information to data sets that don't have it. And so I think we recognize that this is a real need to be able to identify the needs of Indigenous communities, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities, like the communities that do not have as much readily available data. And so I think this is a big focus of particularly this administration, but of ours as a research project to improve our understanding of things. So I think in short, we're working on it. We have some approaches that we're trying to roll out, and hopefully in the near future we'll have better data that we'll be able to report on. But yeah, I think at the moment we're just unfortunately limited by what's available now, though we are trying to improve it.
Any kind of thoughts around data that's needed to better understand and get at some of these questions that you're asking, and how non-competes or occupational licensing are affecting various groups differently?
I mean, I hesitate to answer because Joyce's question is so important, and I feel I just don't know what life is like on a reservation, to be honest. And so I will humbly say I'm not sure what's out there even in terms of data collection or the challenges they face with entrepreneurship. I imagine access to capital. I'm not sure what opportunities there are on reservations. So it's hard for me to say exactly what data needs to be collected. I'm sure that they're underrepresented in our data sets. Absolutely. It seems like maybe some targeted studies could be helpful, but I'm not really the right expert to answer this question, unfortunately.
Yeah, I have a few insights. I also have an affiliation with the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank, and there's a large number of studies and work that they're doing in American Indian country. And part of that is to look at what are the occupational licensing requirements. American Indian country is very unique in that state law doesn't apply in American Indian country. So if you're on a reservation, state law doesn't apply, so that they can legally develop their own set of occupational licensing requirements. They do not need to use the state requirements to become a doctor, teacher, dentist, or a hairdresser. So that there are some very unique institutional arrangements that are allowed, and some of the people at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank are looking at these issues. So I think that it's an area that is currently under investigation, and there's some very different effects given the different laws that do not apply in American Indian country that would apply in other parts of the state.
Thank you. A question here, given all of the events that have transpired over the past year, when we think about COVID, we think about all of the heightened attention to the many racial injustices in our country, we think about business closure and reopening, What have you seen that's changed surrounding some of these barriers to entrepreneurship that you've discussed today? What are some of the things you've seen changed, and what are some of the things that you're going to be paying attention to in particular in the months and years ahead, especially just thinking about what has transpired over the past year and sort of what we're grappling with as a nation?
Well, certainly in terms of occupational licensing, some of the things that I've mentioned, the relaxation of barriers are significant, both in terms of the two issues that I talked about, movement into occupations. For example, in healthcare, there was the largest relaxation of occupational licensing requirements ever with respect to allowing people to enter occupations and bringing back individuals who had let their licenses lapse and allowing them to practice. And that was really because of the spike in demand for these occupations that the institutions were flexible enough to allow individuals to practice without a license. And over the last 2 years, the relaxation of interstate mobility restrictions, both of those should allow individuals to move to where the jobs are and to take advantage of entrepreneurial opportunities within new occupations and across state lines.
I would say that for COVID, I think one thing that COVID has taught us is that geography isn't what it used to be. The fact that you can work remotely has reduced a lot of barriers to switching jobs. And I imagine that the move to online over this last year has also created a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurs to take advantage in this online space. And so I think if I recall correctly, that we've seen those startup applications rise significantly during the last few months. And I think part of that is need-based entrepreneurship, where people maybe have lost their jobs and need to come up with a way to make money. But I think a good chunk of that is probably identifying new opportunities, especially if you were fired from your job and you always wanted to start a business, and now you've got time and maybe you have a way to do that. So I think there's some reallocation that's going on, and also new business opportunities that the pandemic has brought for us.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think I would it's hard to say. I mean, I think I would expect a lot of churn, but the churn is going to make it hard to I think see the trends clearly in the short term, right? So we know, or we have some evidence that there were substantial small business closures among communities of color. Potentially even more than half of Black-owned businesses stopped operating at some point during the pandemic, and I think that we don't have as much clarity around how many of those have reopened and continued working. We know that there were kind of uneven distributions of PPP loans to communities, to small businesses of color, and so I think the survival. So I think one thing I'm really concerned about is the survival rate. Ultimately, as things start to reopen, how many of those businesses are just not coming back? And so I think that's a real concern. But I think to Evan's point, there's also going to be a lot of opportunity for people to start new businesses, whether it is need based. We know from looking at some of the credit data from the past year that debt actually really stabilized for a lot of folks because for people who did lose their job and may have been sitting at home, they were just spending less money, right? There's lower consumption, so they had a little bit more cash laying around to contribute to savings. For people who did lose their job, a lot of them, of course, for a period of time, ended up in situations where they were bringing in more income than they were when they were working, and so some of that went to debt reduction. And so I think some people might have used this opportunity to say, like, yeah, have more time and potentially maybe even a little bit more money, or at least in a slightly better financial situation. Not everyone, but some folks might be in a slightly better financial situation, and will use this opportunity to start a new business, especially as we are looking at unemployment numbers. And I think one of the things that I'm thinking a lot about is how much of this is from people whose preferences and values towards work have shifted a bit, right? Or are they putting a higher priority on staying at home or being able to work remotely? And I think we know that those kind of priorities are actually one of the reasons, or or a more popular reason among entrepreneurs of color for wanting to start a business is wanting to have a bit more flexibility, not wanting to work for a traditional employer. And so I think we might see even faster growth of small business in the next couple of years. So I think I'm anticipating a lot of churn, a lot of closures, but also a lot of folks starting new businesses as well. So I think that's probably going to be a little difficult to tease out, but I think I'd be on the lookout for both of those trends.
Thank you. We just have a few more minutes here before our second panel begins. So I'd like to do a bit of a lightning round to end today's first panel and ask each of you just to reflect briefly, given all that you've shared and all that we've discussed today, what are the one or two, if you can't just choose one, but what are the one or two takeaways that you want to be sure that policymakers know from your work and from what you've been thinking about?
I guess I can start out is that occupational licensing tends to be more sand than grease in the mechanism of the labor market, so that it does tend to reduce the ability of people to move into occupations, across occupations, and there's been very little evidence that it improves quality of services.
I think I would say that, policymakers should be aware of all of the ways, large and small, that firms can try to tie workers to the firm, including using non-competes and other sort of retention devices. And unfortunately, I think the evidence on a lot of those is not as well developed at this point. But I think that in some sense you can generalize from what we've learned about non-competes to what would be the effects of some of these similar provisions on entrepreneurship. And so I think that there's a lot that we can observe from what we have, but then there's a mountain of stuff we can't see yet. And I think that we can maybe begin to do some extrapolations to those other areas as
well. I think I'd say that policymakers, or not just policymakers, but anyone who's interested and invested in supporting increased entrepreneurship among people of color and in communities of color should pay more attention to the debt side, in particular as part of any kind of training or exposure programs. Provide programs and opportunities for people to reduce their debt. I think it's particularly around student loan debt, which of course is a hot topic issue at the moment, but I think it is also a very clear, real issue that does disproportionately affect people of color, given the higher student loan debt to income ratios that I think are preventing people who otherwise, again, could be really strong business owners from being able to move into starting a business. So I think kind of tying some of the conversation around debt reduction, especially student loan debt reduction, and potentially payoff programs to what that might mean for people's ability to start up a small business might be a beneficial avenue or connection. But I think in general, putting more emphasis on the opportunities for increasing creditworthiness through debt reduction, I think is an important thing to focus on.
Yeah. Well, thank you all again for sharing today. Thank you for a great discussion. I know there are still some questions in the Q&A that are coming in, so feel free to respond to those. I know there's some to individuals. At this time, our hour is up. These always go by so quickly, and now it's time to begin our second panel of the morning. So I would like to introduce my colleague, Jason Wiens, who's the Director of Policy here at the Kauffman Foundation. Jason will be serving as moderator and introducing all of our panelists for the second hour of this morning's forum.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you to our first panel. That was great. I learned a lot, and there are some great questions, as Jessica said, that are still in the chat that hopefully the panelists can get to. So we're going to move on now to the second and final panel of today's forum. The topic of this panel is supporting entrepreneurs through policy, programs, and practice what is being done to help break down barriers to entry into entrepreneurship. And we have three wonderful speakers, Wendy Doyle, Kenan Fikri, and Chad Reese. And I'll briefly introduce each of those, and then we'll begin with the presentations. So first, Wendy Doyle. She is the president and CEO at United We, where she leads the organization's efforts to advance women's economic and civic leadership using evidence-based research and policy solutions to make meaningful change. After Wendy, we'll hear from Kenan, who is the Director for Research and Policy Development at EIG, the Economic Innovation Group. As an expert in place-based economic analysis, Kenan has considerable experience advising state and local officials on economic development and regional competitiveness strategies. And then finally, we'll hear from Chad Reese, Activism Policy Manager at the Institute for Justice, where he works to empower entrepreneurs, activists, and everyday people by equipping them with the policy information and communication tools they need to make their voices heard. All right, so without further ado, Wendy, I think we're ready for your presentation.
So thank you. And just a little bit of background about United Women's Empowerment. United We, as Jason said, we work to advance all women's economic and civic leadership by investing in evidence-based research and building out a nonpartisan economic development public policy platform. Our focus has been here in the heartland, but we certainly are expanding across the country as well. In addition, for the civic leadership component of our work, we have an initiative called the Appointments Project. And the Appointments Project is working to get women appointed at the city, county, and state level to boards and commissions. This connects to occupational licensing, particularly in the state area, as a lot of oversight in those appointments oversee professional licensed professions. So a couple of key points and a motivator for United Women's Empowerment, United We, on why we have leaned into occupational licensing is really some key statistics. And so we have definitely seen along the way that an uptick in women who have entered the entrepreneurship space. But according to research by the National Association of Women Business Owners, more than half of the women-owned businesses are the breadwinners of the family, and 65% of women of color are the breadwinners of the family. So that is our motivation, that we want to keep women entrepreneurs engaged. So as it relates to the occupational licensing work that we have done, focusing on the state of Missouri, we really, have spent a lot of time educating, but, the public safety health challenges with some of the key licensed professions, such as pharmacy, medicine, the application across all occupations, it's not evergreen. So, as Maura stated in the previous presentation, that licensing requirements are certainly different by state, but certainly it's not a one size fits all in the requirements and the oversight of it. So the data that we invested in a research study back in 2016, thanks again to the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation for investing in us to be able to do so. We partnered with the University of Missouri's Institute of Public Policy, and they created a policy brief that really provided as an education tool for us to be able to share with policymakers. And some key findings of that research study really identified that women in the state of Missouri hold a professional license at 3 times a higher rate than men do. Benchmarking that of what's happening at the national level in the United States, it's 28% women hold a certification or license compared to 23% of men, employed men. So this really provided, again, the evidence for us as an organization providing a gender lens to our occupational licensing work. Some of the progress that we have made in the state of Missouri has been really first by starting with an education opportunity through an executive order that the previous governor in Missouri did. And the executive order called for a task force to be convened to review all licensed professions in the state of Missouri. And that report was delivered to the governor with some recommendations of some consolidating, of some, disbanding some of the licensed professions. A lot of that work would require legislation to be able to actually implement. But we did begin in the state of Missouri with having some good information to build on. Secondly, we started our work really educating and using our policy brief to educate policymakers about occupational licensing. So really building on the education piece first. We spent a lot of time traveling around the state of Missouri, spending time with policymakers, helping them understand how complicated the occupational licensing space is in the state of Missouri. Our first success came with some legislation that we passed with Senate Bill 843 in 2018, and it was military reciprocity. Morris had cited that in the previous panel, that this is a really good strategy. And I'm happy to report that we've started some occupational licensing work in the state of Kansas and delivered to Governor Kelly's desk just a few weeks ago a House Bill 2066 for military reciprocity as well. So starting to share our occupational licensing practice with the state of Kansas. We next moved into some additional military reciprocity, but really last year we made some significant progress with House Bill 2046. And this was modeled after the state of Arizona, and it was bringing reciprocity across all occupations for the state of Missouri. Missouri was the second state to really take an aggressive approach. The other addition to that piece of legislation was narrowing the ways in which boards can deny licenses based on criminal history to make sure there is a tighter relationship between crime committed and the job that one would do, which is a strategy for the state to reduce recidivism rates. So we felt very pretty aggressive. The governor wanted that delivered to his desk to sign, and that happened during the pandemic. So we were extremely delighted to be able to deliver that to him. Just last week, our legislative session ended in the state of Missouri, and we are delivering House Bill 273, and it includes a number of pieces of licensing deregulation. And we're delighted, we've been working on this for several years, that shampooing deregulation in the cosmetology field is included in that. So now in the state of Missouri, to be able to do shampooing, you just need to have oversight by a licensed cosmetologist or a licensed barber. We see this as a strategy to start to further build culture in the state of Missouri, for shampooing to be an apprenticeship for a young person to maybe then move into securing a cosmetology license, and again, a low income profession. Second piece that's included in that is some additional military reciprocity. But third, we're delighted to also include in this our first occupational therapy licensure compact. So then having the compact with 10 surrounding states to be able to practice occupational therapist work. So we're delighted to be able to do that. Again, the final point that I wanted to make is really the why for us to continue this work in this space is, according to the McKinsey Institute, the states of Missouri and Kansas, and of course, several other states, have the potential to grow by as much as 15% by 2025 if women fully participate in the workforce. So this again is our motivation to reduce barriers for women to become entrepreneurs, to get women back to work post-pandemic, and do our part to make it easier for those who want to bring their licensed profession to the state of Missouri. Thank you, Jason. Back to you.
Thank you, Wendy. That was great, and thank you for the work that you and United We are doing. I think it was a great example following our first panel to hear, Morris presented a lot of the evidence around occupational licensing, and then to hear how United We has used that and additional evidence and data on the impacts of occupational licensing and how it limits entrepreneurial opportunities, especially, as you said, for women, and now putting that into practice and change is occurring as a result. So thank you. All right, we're going to move on now to Kenan, who's going to speak to us about non-compete agreements.
Thank you, Jason, and thanks, Wendy, too. That was really inspiring. So thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you here today to talk about non-compete agreements and their impacts on entrepreneurship, and also some live efforts for reform that we as an organization are interested in, and other ones that we're just watching and observers of. So EIG, actually I'll rest here for the opening. EIG, we're a research and policy an advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C., and our core mission is to advance creative policy solutions to foster a more entrepreneurial and dynamic economy all throughout the United States. So there's a real kind of geographic tinge to everything that we do, especially on the research side. And much of our work and research work, if you're familiar with it, it analyzes trends in well-being, in entrepreneurship, and the health of the economy geographically. And given our mission, we are very aware of the long-term decline that the United States has seen in its startup rate, and also the accelerated decline that we experienced with the Great Recession, and the fact that this is one of the few economic indicators that really never recovered over the course of the really decade-long expansion that followed the Great Recession, which to us shows that there are some there was a real step change in the entrepreneurial environment that the country was experiencing, and that a number of issues are probably weighing on the country's entrepreneurs or would-be entrepreneurs. And of course, this national trend is playing out in regions across the country. So in 2018, at the national level, we saw on that last slide, the startup rate barely outpaced the rate at which firms close pretty naturally and steadily throughout the economy. And we see that as startup rates have fallen across much of the country, especially in the Great Lakes and parts of the South, we've seen about 60% of metro areas, even in 2018, had fewer firms starting than closing, than closed in that year. Again, that was a peak year in the national recovery. So these trends are consistent across sectors as well, and they mean that from a local perspective, especially, replenishing the startup pipeline is really essential to kind of ensuring future prosperity down the road, and that you're ready to replace the employers of today with the employers of tomorrow. And as we scan the economic and policy landscape for factors that could be weighing on entrepreneurship and kind of blocking the pipeline of people into new enterprises, we see kind of non-competes as an example of kind of some of the just slow creeping sclerosis that's setting in across the economy, that in microeconomic decision and transaction after another is slowing the entry of people into entrepreneurship and slowing the survival rates of new and young firms too. So as Evan said, we don't have any research yet that explicitly ties the proliferation of non-compete agreements to the decline of entrepreneurship. I think the intuition is pretty clear, and we'll walk through that. But it's still pretty obvious that as we're thinking, what economic policy housekeeping can we be doing here? Non-competes, at least us, and here my advocacy hat is on, is something that looks like a prime candidate to kind of be swept out or at least curtailed as its use has evolved over time. And so we really come at this issue from the perspective of entrepreneurship. And the churning of workers from the perspective of economic development, because the churning of workers in a labor market is an essential driver of innovation in the United States and in every one of our metropolitan areas. And it's a really essential ingredient in any healthy startup ecosystem, that you have people kind of spinning out and hiring and recombining, in a local economy in a really dynamic way that creates the ideas and the enterprises of the future. Now, I'm not here, I am by no means an advocate for the spilling of all trade secrets and all, and there are plenty of tools to protect those, as Evan mentioned. We have trade secret laws, non-disclosure agreements, non-solicitation agreements, but I'm talking about the ability, of a worker to take their body of knowledge and go either start a new firm with it or go take it somewhere else and kind of plant that seed in a new environment and watch it grow. So concretely, see kind of two primary ways in which non-competes stymie entrepreneurship. So one, they can prevent individuals from starting a business in the same line of work as their prior employer in a geographic area in a given period of time. So in other words, it just blocks spin-offs from incumbent employers. And as anyone who's seen kind of the genealogy of local metropolitan areas, kind of big employer base knows, it's these spin-offs of employers that really do kind of help places grow and stay thriving. and non-competes are kind of it's now a legal obstacle from that process taking hold. And there's also evidence through research from Evan and his colleagues that non-competes especially reduce entrepreneurship among women, minority groups, and others kind of with lower risk tolerances. Where if you're in an area where a non-compete's enforceable, you may have to close your work, or you may get sued, or you close your new business, or may get sued, and that seems to affect decisions kind of based on individual risk tolerances, some of which are pretty consistent across demographic groups. And then two, non-competes can also prevent startups from hiring the talent that they need to scale and survive. Again, just think for a second, if you're kind of in a mid-sized metropolitan area and you are an aerospace startup, and I don't know if Boeing uses non-competes, but say for a moment that they do, and good luck, trying to hire all the talent that you need to grow if Boeing does use a non-compete and you can't tap into that knowledge and that pool or bring anyone on board your organization. I think that really lowers your prospects of excelling. And we're seeing and we see from the research that non-competes reduce the growth and survival rates of young firms generally. So there's kind of a broad consensus for reforming non-compete agreements and almost banning their use for low-wage workers. That's really kind of happened at the national level and in states across the country. But what we as an organization are really concerned about is building on that and making sure that policymakers are aware that as they're considering non-competes reform and kind of considering all the benefits that they may garner for low-wage workers, when low-wage workers get to benefit from competition for their labor, that they also are aware of kind of the innovation and entrepreneurship related repercussions of the proliferation of non-compete agreements, and are thinking of at least considering kind of expanding kind of the wage caps that many states are placing on their non-compete reform bills, so that they can kind of reach higher wage workers who often have more education and generally have a higher propensity to innovate or start their own companies. So we are working at the federal level quite closely with a bipartisan, bicameral group of legislators around the Workforce Mobility Act, which is essentially, it's kind of the boldest federal non-competes piece of legislation put forward yet, that would essentially ban the use of non-compete agreements, the presentation of them and the enforcement of them in all but really exceptional circumstances, like the sale of a company. And we're seeing that. I think this is really notable because, and we worked very hard to get some Republican support on this bill. Traditionally that's the party of business, and it's been harder for Republicans to sign on to non-competes reform. But we've seen a new kind of current as the country's politics are recalibrating, and kind of populist energy can be channeled in some constructive ways, and is kind of bubbling on both sides of the both sides of the aisle, that there is appetite for kind of an economic libertarian argument that the use of a non-compete agreements is in many ways kind of offensive to the basic promise that the economy is supposed to be extending to American workers, that in the system, you can sell your labor to the highest bidder, and there's no one should be able to exert power over how you choose to exercise your right to work across the country. And that has found some resonance in some groups, but not in all yet, but we're working on that, and I'll close with some kind of messages that we're finding are really resonating to broaden support, especially on that traditionally more skeptical side of the aisle. And then we're also seeing, as Evan mentioned, really increasing state interest in non-compete reform. In 2019, it was a watershed year. 29 states considered reforms. I believe it went up in 2020, and it's on course to probably match that rate in 2021. So we're really seeing a flurry of activity. There's an effort underway right now with the Uniform Law Commission. That's a group that kind of makes nonpartisan template legislation for states to consider. That's pending this year. And we've seen in the District of Columbia, I think the first time a state has in recent memory actually implemented a full ban on non-competes. And again, this was driven by their desire to kind of diversify the economy and foster a startup ecosystem locally. But in other states, in Connecticut and Missouri with the Right to Start Act, They started trying to go really broad with coverage, but as things move through committee, often the vested interests end up watering bills down. So that's a real uphill climb that folks are facing. So in closing, actually, I could, I'll just say very quickly, presenting here a couple arguments that we're seeing are resonating in broadening support among traditionally skeptical kind of pro-business folks who adopt a very narrow definition and a simple definition of what pro-business means. So one, it's helpful to just get people to articulate their opposition. It generally boils down to, we're in a market economy, but we don't feel like we should have to compete for workers, and we don't want to anything that reduces our wage bill or reduces our turnover has to be good, right? So that can then the support can fall away. There are also extremely blunt instruments. So again, we talked about this, and there are other kind of tools available to protect those legitimate business interests. And I think especially in the wake of the pandemic, when employers are struggling to hire, one employer's use of a non-compete agreement can have collateral damage across an entire labor market, right? As folks maybe have even been fired, but they're still subject to the agreement, and they can't go join a new firm that's trying to ramp up because they're still subject to the non-compete beforehand. So I think there's a real moment for reform here. And then as we heard in the last panel too, stories are really important. The momentum for national reform around low-wage workers was driven really by some excellent journalism from the New York Times on stories of people whose lives were changed generally for the negative because they couldn't take their lifetime body of knowledge and go deploy it in their work. And we haven't seen as many similar stories about the kind of the startups that never formed because of non-compete. And I think if we had more of those, it'd be really compelling. So thanks for the time, and apologies for going a little over, Jason.
That's great. Thank you, Kenan. Appreciate that. And helpful to hear from your experience at EIG about what some of those key messages are that are resonating with policymakers and others as you make the case and explain to them the research and data around non-competes. All right, we're going to head over to our final speaker, Chad. And as we bring Chad on, I want to remind and encourage all of our participants who are watching the forum today. If you have questions for any of our speakers, please put those into the Q&A chat box, and we will try and get to those in the Q&A discussion coming up momentarily. All right, so welcome, Chad. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much, and appreciate both this panel and the Kauffman Foundation for having me. I do not have any slides today, and I think that is largely due to the content of my talk, which is a little bit different from what we've heard so far. So a lot of the conversations we've had thus far have been sort of on topics that I think people have long recognized, or at least have been over the last few years recognizing are big challenges and barriers to entrepreneurship. And so now it's about doing the research and showcasing the research to convince people how to fix those problems. I think what I'm going to talk about today a little bit is something that I found comes as a shock to people, even within the entrepreneurial community, and certainly within the policymaker community. And you can think of it as the flip side to what Stephen talked about in the first panel. So I'm going to be talking about debt-imposed barriers to entry, but often when we think about using policy to break down barriers for entrepreneurs, I think the conversation goes something like, here's a barrier that already exists for people who want to start their own business. Now, what are the policy tools at our disposal to try to address those? And that's a very normal conversation to have in these sorts of events. I think I want to look at the topic a little differently today and talk about a barrier that's entirely a product of public policy. And that's a specific kind of debt-imposed barrier to entry that's associated with state and municipal fines and fees. And the best way to think about this particular issue is to just use an example. And since I, like many of our other speakers, am here in Washington, D.C., I'll talk a little bit about Washington, D.C.'s provision. It's called the Clean Hands Law. That's a policy that bars access to government-issued licenses and permits, which importantly would be any business license or any permits you need to start and run or operate your business for anyone who owes just $100 or more in debt to the city. So when I talk to people in Washington, D.C., and when we first started speaking with council members and regulators, and even people in the entrepreneurial ecosystem around here, a lot of people hear about the clean hands provision or fines and fees as a debt burden to entrepreneurship, and they conceptualize it as a shady company who refuses to pay their taxes or a company that keeps getting fined for violating the same city regulations. But if you think back to what I mentioned, the law actually is, it's just a $100 threshold. So that could be, especially if there's a late fee or something attached, a single traffic or a parking ticket. It could be your grass is too tall, or you didn't get something in your house repaired and a building inspector gave you a significant fine. And I think perhaps worst in DC's case, the local water utility counts as a quasi-government entity, which means that being late on your water bill could trigger a clean hands license denial and completely block someone from the business startup process, even before they have a chance to get going and see if their product or their service is viable and providing value to themselves and their community. So this is DC's specific approach, but it's a common problem across the country. My team just did a quick survey of about 22 different cities, and very quickly were able to find that more than half of them had something like this. Now, it's a tricky question to answer in terms of how many cities have a provision like this, because they can be found all over the city's code. Cities tend to call them sort of by these cutesy names like clean hands provision here in DC. So for one, they're hard to find. And two, cities are, perhaps not surprisingly, not particularly excited to or willing to collect and share data on how many people in the city owe them money at any given time. A lot of times outstanding debts to municipal fines and fees can be spread across multiple different jurisdictions. Might be court fees involved, a traffic ticket here and there, like I said, a building inspection fine somewhere else. And so there may just not be a place anywhere in the city or state for you to go to even find out what the total amount that you owe. And for some cities, it wouldn't matter because there's not even a dollar threshold that you have to reach. Just any outstanding debt to the city could trigger a denial of your license or permit. And so usually most folks kind of understand when we get to this point in the conversation what that means for entrepreneurs, right? You fall behind on a single month utility bill. You make a single mistake on your taxes that takes a little bit of time to work out the details on, or a single traffic or speeding ticket. And suddenly the city you live in has just made the determination that you are somehow not fit to own and operate your own business. And I think, again, going back to Stephen's comments in the first panel, the people who are going to be most affected by that are folks who are already most financially vulnerable, right? If you have any kind of private debt that you're also trying to pay off, or if you're in a community that might be over-policed, right? Many of you might be familiar with the now famous 2015 report by the Department of Justice that looked into the fining and fee practice in Ferguson, Missouri after Michael Brown was killed. Now, in Ferguson's case, they were essentially treating their citizens like ATMs, particularly in parts of the community that were largely communities of color. They were aggressively fining people for petty things like tall grass, and then they would charge absurd late fees for those who couldn't pay immediately. And so suddenly you've created a debt burden purely as a product of public policy, even where it may not have existed for potential entrepreneurs before. So I should also mention that these policies are bad for everyone. I'm talking about this from an entrepreneur perspective, but cities that become dependent on fines and fees for their budget revenue are basically setting themselves up for failure because it's not a reliable or a sustainable way to finance your budget. I mean, if you think about tax revenue, which is normally how a city would finance itself, if people make more money or their values of their property go up, tax revenue goes up. It's sort of cities are making more revenue, but people are wealthier, so it works out. Here it's a lose-lose where you're just taking money from people because their grass was too high. It's not like you created any value for them and they're paying you. And the wealthier the city gets, in this case, the poorer the people get. You create these sort of vicious downward cycles. So obviously citizens lose if their governments are turning their regulatory and law enforcement efforts against the people they're supposed to protect. It was just the flip side of that. I will say cities are starting to acknowledge this is a problem, and that's been really encouraging. A lot of the work that's been done so far on eliminating these debt barriers has been focused on driver's licenses. Because again, I've been talking about sort of entrepreneurs trying to get a business license to start their business or to get a building permit to actually move into their new facility. But DC is a great example where if you actually look at the law under clean hands, it says with, I think, 2 exceptions, any license or permit that would be issued by the city, and that includes driver's licenses. So I know that's been a big focus for a lot of folks and is equally relevant for entrepreneurs, because if you can't drive to wherever your place of business is or wherever your customers or clients are, then it's tough to have a business. But I think policymakers are increasingly recognizing that those same policies also stop entrepreneurs from obtaining other licenses and permits that they would need to start their businesses. So we like to highlight kind of 4 general categories of potential reform in this space that cities could undertake any or hopefully all of. The first and probably the most important is just to eliminate the root problem. And that's to eliminate fines and fees that trap entrepreneurs in a cycle of debt, including punitive, unreasonable late fees. And these are usually pretty easy to spot. Again, I keep mentioning tall grass because while it might make sense for a city to have certain health and safety regulations for their building inspecting department, if you've got building inspectors that you're paying to go out with a ruler and measure people's grass to see if it's 2 inches or 3.5 inches tall, not only are you wasting city money, but you're basically terrorizing your own populace at that point and creating this sort of odd, predatory system of fines and fees. And so cities can just eliminate a lot of those, or at least pare back on them. The second reform would be just ending requirements that prevent entrepreneurs from obtaining a business license if they have unrelated or minor unpaid fines and fees. So again, we're not talking about businesses that have been avoiding their taxes for years, or operating under the table illegally. We're not talking about people who have falsified their licensing applications. We might be talking about somebody who wants to open a restaurant and they have a speeding ticket. And there's nothing naturally that connects the idea of, well, I was going a little too fast once, but now I want to open a restaurant, right? This is not a sort of punishment that fits the crime. And so anytime you can disentangle those requirements in a city's laws, it's really going to open up people and make it one less barrier that they have to overcome. The next step, and this is maybe one of the most common sense ones of all of these, is just to raise the threshold of these debt barriers to target true repeat offenders, so that a single parking ticket, a single traffic ticket is not the difference between starting up your business and having to go all the way back to square one. Here in DC, again, I'll just mention that the Institute for Justice is working with DC Council to try and pass a number of reforms to clean hands. There's a bill that's active in the council now, and one of the simplest parts of that bill is that it would raise that triggering threshold from $100 to $5,000. And while we've certainly seen at IJ a number of cases across the country where predatory fines and fees can get into the thousands and tens of thousands of dollars, even for residents or entrepreneurs who haven't done anything that most people would consider wrong or worth that amount of fining, at least you're getting away from there was a single misunderstanding or I made a single mistake, to really trying to get the city to focus on the intent of these laws, which is to prevent repeat offenders from accessing government services. As I said, that's about as common sense as it gets. And then finally, and I'd say San Francisco is a good example of where this has worked, is cities can use amnesty programs to allow residents to hit the reset button on their debts and get a fresh start. We've seen a couple of charts here that have really noticeable dips around 2007, 2008, and then again over the last couple of years, where entrepreneurs have dealt with a financial crisis, and then just a few years later had to deal with a pandemic that just dramatically altered the business landscape. And so cities should recognize that things have not been normal for a couple of decades now, and a lot of people might be struggling with debt that they might not otherwise have to deal with, or they might have incurred sort of strange, archaic fines and fees that aren't doing the city any good. They're not going to raise that money in the end anyway. And cities can just offer an amnesty program to give folks a chance to get that fresh start. So with that, happy to talk more about this in the Q&A section or answer any questions. But again, just to provide that flip side of, there's not only sort of private debt that prevents entrepreneurs from getting started, but there's this sort of public policy, municipal and state fines and fees debt that can be a real barrier as well.
Thank you, Chad. Appreciate that education on that topic of public debt and these debt imposed barriers that are in many instances precluding people from starting a business and providing a way for themselves and their family to make more money. As we welcome back our 3 panelists onto camera, Chad, Kenan, and Wendy, I just wanted to mention that on all 3 of these policy topics that this panel and the forum really have addressed: debt, non-compete agreements, and occupational licensing. These are all aspects of the Kauffman Foundation's policy agenda called America's New Business Plan. I think that was shared with participants in the chat. Encourage you to take a look at that and to learn more about these particular areas of policy, plus other things and the funding and support and how do we provide knowledge and skills to entrepreneurship and what's the role of government at the federal, state, and local levels to do that. All right, so again, if you have questions for Wendy, Kenan, or Chad, please put them in the Q&A. We'll try and get to them. I have a few questions of my own. And I want to start with this question. I think the examples that all three of you shared really illustrate how advocacy efforts can be strengthened when they're informed by research findings. Wendy, in particular, I know in your remarks, you talked about, the work United We did really began with education and talking to policymakers. Well, here's what we know. Like, this is what the research says. This is the data. These are the facts, right? And so my question is, how can researchers and advocates like you and your organizations work more closely together to inform one another's work? What thoughts do you guys have on that question?
I can jump in with one thought, and I'll be pretty brief. I think there are some great examples that are highlighted in the plan from Kauffman that you actually just cited. And one of the reasons we even know about this problem is because of different researchers looking at what they thought were different problems that kind of coalesced around this idea of municipality imposed debt barriers. So for instance, there's a great UCLA study that was primarily just looking at a lot of court fines and fees and issues like that. And they're the ones that found that of eight different states that they looked at, none of them had a central repository to find out if you're a resident, who do I owe money to in the government? How much money do I owe? And then there's another great example from the Fines and Fees Justice Center in there that highlights that, at one point, 1 in 7 residents in North Carolina had a suspended license due to a failure to pay a fine or appear in traffic court. And again, neither of those was specifically looking at entrepreneurial barriers. So I think it's incumbent on folks like us to broaden who we're talking to and not just look at folks that we might think of as traditionally in the entrepreneur ecosystem, but try to understand the root causes of these problems so that we can find those research data points. Because a lot of what we're doing, and I think this is especially true for my fellow panelists, are identifying problems that policymakers don't know about. And so it just might not be a lot of research to begin with. So yeah, my recommendation is to make sure you're also looking at folks who don't even know that they're identifying a problem for entrepreneurs. And then it's kind of our job to tie those two together.
Jason, I would just add what we've learned as we have shared the policy briefs and research with the policymakers that, a key point that we could work more closely with the researchers is, as Kenan referenced, storytelling. So really having, applicable stories to be a proof point to the quantitative research. We hear that time and time again. So what? So bring us, how is this, really applying in our state? I think the second thing that we consistently hear is, comparative data of what's happening in other states. So policymakers are like, great, this is applying to our state, but what are others doing as a best practice? So researchers could, we could shore up some time if we had more comparative data.
Yeah, I'll just round out that, in all of our advocacy efforts, we've found that, the problem statement, which is usually data, and then the local kind of anecdote and story of the backyard is a really powerful duo. And, researchers can provide the first, advocates or even just anyone can provide the second. And then I think having the right ally, really helps too. Someone who actually can lobby or advocate or something like that for the issue is helpful too. So you're not just raising it, but you're making sure it's getting in front of people. And that usually, I think can often lead to change because these people are in public policy usually to solve problems, and kind of giving them the whole package of what it is, why it affects people, and what you can do about it is often well received, at least in advancing the debate further. And some of these are really long games, but I have to get started.
Yeah, great. No, I love all of those points. Broadening the conversation, Chad, as you talked about, and thinking about one thing that I think always is very interesting when doing this work that we do on entrepreneurship is that so many different areas of public policy impact the ability of someone to start or grow a business. And so it's not a siloed topic in that sense. So kind of really expanding your lens as you're thinking about, yeah, what are the problems and what does the research and data show from different angles about that problem? How can that inform then the case that I'm making to folks in public office who have the ability to make that change? And then of course, yes, the marrying of the data and the facts with the personal experiences. I worked for a member of Congress for 10 years, and I always say, while he would use data and facts to support what his positions, a story that someone told him that stuck with him, he would repeat for years and years and years, right? So those stories are very important. And when they are grounded and reinforce what the data and literature should tell us, that's when advocates, I think, have a very powerful case to move change forward. All right, let me ask another question about data, because this has been something that came up in our first panel. So several of you have mentioned it as well. One of the challenges when it comes to entrepreneurship data is that a lot of the robust data we have on entrepreneurship is big picture, federal level data. Some data sources, we might have data on some of the largest metropolitan areas in the country. But when it gets down to, the more granular data on, what is happening in my community, especially if I live in a smaller city or county, it can be hard for advocates to provide that data that the local policymakers might need. And so my question is just on this issue, what are your thoughts on how researchers and advocates, again, might be able to work more closely together to close some of these data gaps, particularly that exist at the local level?
Jason, I'll jump in here. One of the things we've identified that as an issue, and we're taking that on as an organization. And because there isn't as much in more rural communities, we're going out to the rural communities and hosting town hall sessions to really convene and hear firsthand, and bringing that information back to the researchers to then have that qualitative information to maybe then lead them to go find the quantitative that's happening in that rural community. So we've kind of done the reverse, where we've taken, as the organization, the initiative to go out and be intentional to hear firsthand. And when we're doing those, to engage the policymakers to join us in those conversations, join us and hear firsthand too.
Great.
And I think we really have to get creative. I think Evan's research from the first panel is a great example. We didn't know anything about non-competes until they started making surveys about them, and that's a qualitative data set that's survey based. So I think as we get increasingly powerful tools to collect some of that data, it will be really important. And here I think advocates and researchers can come together to just figure out who to reach with it. And again, if you're trying to mine employment contracts or whatever, just collate this data, or local government laws, just figuring out how to go about that and where to go and who can help finance it and things like that will be really important.
Yeah, Chad, maybe let me ask you like an iteration of this question, because you said a lot of cities, when it comes to debt, it's multiple departments that have this data, and the city may have a disincentive to actually know and publicize, how much debt do its citizens collectively owe. Any thoughts on ways that when local government might be a source of data, how do we extract that data or get it to be shared more widely or put in a form that's more usable, both for advocates and for others to then do research and help them better understand a potential problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. And here in DC in particular, two things come to mind. One is a lot of this data, again, I keep mentioning traffic and parking tickets. So a lot of this data is housed at DMV. Another huge sort of bizarre set of these fines and fees come from people who don't pay for their metro or subway ticket, sort of jump the fare gates kind of thing. And that's a whole different department, and Metro doesn't want to share that information. I think in addition to echoing Wendy's point about the sort of town hall roundtable format, individual entrepreneurs on the ground a lot of times know about these issues first, and that's how you find out about them. But then in order to access and put together useful data, I think the only way that happens is building relationships with, the closest regulatory entity you're going to find. And I think as advocates and researchers, kind of both in IJ's role, we've been building a really good relationship for years with DC's primary regulatory authority here locally. And as someone else said, I think it might have been Kenan, pointed out, people get in these positions because ideally they want to solve policy problems. And so it's very easy to sometimes view, especially on an issue like municipal fines and fees, the municipality itself as kind of the bad guy or the boogeyman. But you can find folks within those departments that maybe they just started, maybe they don't know about this issue, they're open-minded, they're willing to work with you. And particularly if they've got a leader with a reform mindset, that helps a lot. But just building that relationship and working constructively over the long haul. Now, sometimes you'll find a situation where that data is just not going to come voluntarily. And in that case, my best recommendation for folks is just to get really comfortable with open records requests and to get used to using them, right? I mean, the first preferred alternative is always that long-term relationship with the sort of bureaucracy that exists already, because you'll eventually find someone in there that has access to data and is willing to work with you. And then if it truly is a sort of predatory municipality situation, like we saw in Ferguson, it's going to have to be working with maybe even investigative local journalists for your local newspaper or something like that, and applying tools like FOIA and open data requests to get that kind of information.
Jason, I just would like to add and build on what Chad mentioned is, through our work and when researchers we're trying to get information back from the state or city, county, data collection, data is just not available. And, we need to be doing a better job. And we have pointed this out, in particular to the state. We need to do a better job of collecting information. And we don't even have a starting point. So for example, in occupational licensing space, we don't even have it broken down by gender. So we can't tell you how many men and women are licensed in a particular profession. We just don't know. So, if we could wave a magic wand and we could get better information at the city, county, and state level, that would better inform the researchers on here's what's really happening. But we just need we don't even have a starting point.
Interesting.
And I'll build on another thing Chad said, that with so much of the barriers that entrepreneurs encounter, I think are there really because someone passed something once and no one thought about it again, or they didn't know what the repercussion was. We see in non-competes, a lot of companies don't really know that it's in their employment agreements. Just someone in the law department threw it in and then no one asked a question. And you're going to have many examples of these things too, or maybe there was a well-intentioned law, but no one thought about what its impact might be on entrepreneurs. So how might we go about reforming it? So that's why just raising the issue is the first step to getting an ally. Of course, it sounds obvious, but it's so useful to say.
Yeah, great thoughts. Appreciate that. All right, we just have a few more minutes left before I'm going to turn it back over to Jessica. And so perhaps our last question of the panel is open-ended. And I'm just curious, we started the conversation hearing from some researchers, and I want to know from you guys each, what additional research or data do you wish you had? Kenan, I think you said something about, or maybe it was Wendy, about the magic wand, right? So picture you have that magic wand for the specific issues that you and your organizations are working on. How would you wave that? What would you ask to appear? And how would that help you inform the advocacy work that you're doing?
I can start. I would say for us, which would be beneficial is once we've had these bills passed and become into law, we would like to have the research information on the implementation of them. How is it working? And again, that's data collection, that's information that we need, but we have no idea, on low-income professions, how many actually, received a license with a low-income profession. We just don't have that information. So for us, we've done this work, we've delivered, we've changed the law, but how is it really, being implemented, and what are those numbers look like?
Thank you.
Yeah, and I can chime in. Mine's pretty simple, actually, which is I would love actual numbers on how many people get stopped specifically by municipality imposed debts or fines and fees. One thing I didn't mention about Washington, D.C.'s clean hands provision is there's almost no way for the city to collect data on who gets stopped by fines and fees, because the clean hands provision, just where it happens, it's very early in the application process. And you're directed to a website that says, fill out this affidavit that says, I don't owe $100 or more. And it turns out if you're lying, we're going to fine you a lot of money and prevent your license from going through, which means that a lot of people who think like, oh, I'd like to start a business, they start clicking through websites or they make a couple phone calls, they see that web page and they never start the application process. So it's data that we can't really get from the government agency. It's probably going to have to come from survey data. And seeing it from multi-city comparisons, particularly after reforms have passed, like San Francisco's amnesty programs, or assuming we can get some clean hands reform here in DC, to see if those things really make a difference, and to see what kinds of things make a difference. So is it raising the threshold? Is it eliminating categories like traffic-related fines and fees, because those don't have anything to do with most business types that entrepreneurs want to start out with? But yeah, it's really trying to pare down how many people is this stopping, and then which of the many different approaches to reform is going to have the most impact to get those numbers down.
Thanks, Chad.
And my magic wand would go a little beyond entrepreneurship, and I would love an open, anonymized database of employment contracts to understand kind of how non-competes fit into what seems to be kind of a creeping redefinition of almost the employer-employee relationship in the economy as it becomes increasingly kind of legalized and weighed down with various provisions. So I'd like to better understand that, and I think that could spark a whole kind of its own subset of threads of research.
Great. Yeah, makes sense. And just one closing thought for me. Thank you, Chad, Kenan, and Wendy for your remarks and your participation today. I think both I don't know if this is the case for researchers, but I think sometimes for advocates, it can be the case that, our work leads up to the point of policy change. But then Chad, you and Wendy both mentioned, we want to have data also on, well, what happens afterwards, right? And so that can be just as valuable, that data on, all right, what happens when the non-compete change, when cities change the way in which they're thinking about debt collection from residents of their community. And that can further inform other evolutions of policy change so that we can really target those interventions to have the maximum effect and intent that we want. All right, that is it for us. Thank you very much. Jessica, I'm going to turn it back to you to close us out today.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to all of our panelists for such a great discussion today. Really enjoyed it. And thank you to to everyone who came and joined us today and who provided questions, and just really enjoyed this conversation. Want to let you know that there is a recording of this forum that will be made available on our website. And there you will also find recordings from previous forums in case you missed them or wanted to catch them again. Feel free to view those. Want to let you know that our next Entrepreneurship Issue Forum coming up in June on Thursday, June 24th. It's going to begin at 10 a.m., run from 10 to noon, so a bit later than we started this morning. That's 10 to noon Central. And we're actually going to be digging into several of the issues that Stephen Brown was addressing in his presentation, looking specifically at student loans and entrepreneurship, looking at the current research landscape as well as policy considerations. So it should be a really great discussion, and I look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.